All right, chapter 25. Industrialization leads to imperialism. Imperialism is a big part of the exam. This information you're guaranteed to see on the AP World exam. This is where Europe, which we talked about recently, going through many revolutions, is going to start spreading around the world. Um, you've probably heard of the British Empire, but we're going to talk about British Empire, French Empire, and even American Empire towards the end. All right, so overview. Old imperialism versus new. Let's talk about the term. So imperialism, and yeah, we're talking about empires, but we spell with an I here. That comes from Latin, the old imperium. But imperialism is an old idea. It's been around since Sargon the Great, right? Since Sargon the Conqueror Sargon of Akkad decided to conquer more of Sumeria. So imperialism's always been around. It's just the idea of taking other people's stuff, taking over people's lands and territories and making them part of yourself in one way or another, right? Usually not as equals. Uh, Sometimes historians will make a distinction between old imperialism, which is like what Persia did in the early days of China and the Roman Empire, older imperialism versus newer imperialism. So old imperialism was where you conquered your neighbors, typically. So the Greeks did it, the Romans did it, basically everybody did it at one point. You would conquer the people immediately surrounding you. All right, so you would consolidate yourself as a country, as a people, and then you would spread out and start conquering other ones who are near you, oftentimes enslaving these people, and then forcing them to do work and labor and things like that, or just at the very least taking their valuables. New imperialism is a little different. So when we're talking about 19th century imperialism, we're talking about where mainly the Europeans, although eventually America will jump on board too, will start spreading beyond their borders. Instead of conquering the people next to them, they're going to start conquering worldwide. And this is going to be for a few reasons. One major reason, if you think about it, like England, France, Germany, why didn't they just conquer each other? Well, because there are other industrial powers. The Industrial Revolution is going to give them a huge advantage over everybody else. And as a result, they are going to conquer the people who are it is easier to conquer. America is not going to conquer Europe at this time. Europe's not going to conquer the United States of America, but they are going to conquer Africa and India, and they're going to get involved with China, not outright conquering it, but other places who didn't industrialize because it was easier to do. India and Africa will be the first to fall. We'll have whole sections devoted just to them. But basically, everybody else, many island nations as well, during this time period will be conquered. Europeans, mainly England, will use their industrial might to conquer the world. Remember, the first country in Europe to industrialize was England. That gives them a huge head start. And at one point, the British Empire will control about 25% of the world. If you include English-speaking people, so after the American Revolution, America starts conquering. At one point, it was over 30% of the world was dominated by English-speaking people. That's a direct result of the Industrial Revolution and the Industrial Revolution starting in England compared to France and Germany. Don't cry for France. Like France is going to get the other half of Africa for the most part, with some few exceptions. But that's why England's going to get the lion's share. They're going to get all of India eventually, and Australia and other places as well too. Very few places will be left unconquered. So old imperialism, mostly conquering your neighbors. New imperialism, new technologies, industrial revolution will allow them to conquer all around the world now. So why a change? Why was there this change? Well, we already kind of talked about it before with mercantilism. We never really got away from mercantilism. The idea of the mother country conquering out and setting up colonies and using control, that never really went away. Now mercantilism is just bigger and on a larger scale and easier to do. And increasingly, it's going to switch from just trying to control trade and who can buy and sell in different parts of the world. It's going to increasingly become more of, I need to conquer the land. Not just control the money, the flow of money anymore. I need to conquer the land. And why is that? Well, the Industrial Revolution created a monster. And this is usually the metaphor I use for it. The Industrial Revolution created a monster. And the monster eats resources and produces, we'll say, I don't want to say defecates, produces new goods that can be sold around the world. Okay, so this hungry monster, right, starts in England, but then other countries follow suit. This hungry monster needs more. It needs more resources. It needs to keep being fed. And if you don't feed your monster, it'll die, right? Well, British factories were producing textiles and then eventually other goods faster than anything else, faster than anybody had ever seen before in history. And this hungry monster needed more cotton, it needed more wool, it needed more rubber, it needed more whatever, iron, coal, all of these other resources. It needed more and more and more, and it had to keep being fed. Because think about it, if you don't put raw materials into your factory, it'll shut down, right? And the factory will shut down, the factory owner won't make money, those people will be out of jobs, causes economic depression. So what do? Well, you could trade and you could buy resources on the open market fairly. You can go to other parts of the world. But if you have a new technological advantage, if you have a military advantage that nobody else in the world has, and this is sad, but it's the truth, it's easier to take than it is to trade. And so sometimes it's easier just to go out and conquer. So you're going to see Europeans no longer just trying to control the trade of silk and porcelain and stuff like that, and tea. They're going to try to control the land where it is actually produced, get the land directly, and then conquer the people and force them to extract the resources directly for you. You could argue they'd already been doing this with sugar production in the New World, but now we're just moving away from straight up sugar production, trying to control all of the core resources. That go into industrial goods. So textiles, this is going to be a big impact on India, for example, where they force the people to grow cotton to the point where they starve to death. So anyways, industry needs way more resources. Also, a lot of these resources don't come from Europe at all. This picture over here, if you see, this is actually a rubber tree. Original real rubber came from tree sap, very much like maple syrup, and it have to be gathered this way. This tree does not grow in Europe, and there's other examples of that too. But as the industrial ages started to progress, we needed more resources. We had to venture forth out of Europe. All right, next thing, markets. So once your hungry monster machine is eating up all these raw materials and making all of this stuff, you now need somebody to buy the stuff that you're making. And there's only so many people in England or France or Germany. So one day you sell, everybody a t-shirt. The next day, maybe half as many people want to buy that t-shirt. The day after that, not many people want to buy another t-shirt. There's only so many shirts we can buy a week, right? This was a problem they started to see in the Industrial Revolution. They were making things faster than ever before, which solved the problem of population. But now they had a problem if they had too much stuff and not enough people to buy their stuff. Well, mercantilism again. You conquer these people outright, and then oftentimes at gunpoint force their indigenous markets to shut down, so they can't make their own clothing, they can't make their own manufactured goods, shut down their local markets, and then replace it with industrial goods from Europe. So we're going to see places in India and Africa and a lot of other island nations around the world, their indigenous markets, their local clothing productions and manufacturing stuff will be entirely decimated and then be replaced with European goods. So these factories now they have more resources and more people to sell to. We're kind of in this world still to this day where we need people to buy our stuff. Later on, late in the 20th century, we'll talk more about trying to open up China for trade. That was a big deal because China is such a huge population. You need more people to buy your stuff. All right, so why another change in imperialism? Well, this is the main one here. The economic reasons are the main reasons why you're going to see imperialism. But there's other stuff that allowed it to happen. New communication and transportation technology, steam engines and steamships. We talked about that. Also, the telegraph and telephone. Now we had the ability to coordinate land forces across the entire world, especially when the telegraph lines go into the ocean. Now, if there's an uprising in people in India or Africa, it can be telegraphed right to British ships and through radio waves, and then right to the British Empire through telegraph lines, and you can have almost instant communication, and people can start figuring out how to solve the problems of empire. That's something that Rome never had. I mean, really, one of Rome's biggest drawbacks and why they could only get so big was communication. Well, that problem's solved now. Of course, trains will also be a big part of that as well too. New technology gave a huge unfair advantage. We're going to talk a lot about this, especially with machine guns. We're not there yet, but the machine gun is going to be the big change. The devil's paintbrush. New technology gave a huge unfair advantage over historical power bands. For most of history, China and India especially could have easily rivaled anyone in Europe, but Europe was kind of a backwater. They were not technologically advanced. Well, now with the industrial age, everything changed. Remember, the Europeans conquered the entirety of the New World, North and South America, before they could conquer Africa. And why was that? Well, Africa had a large population with their own disease immunities and their own diseases that Europeans did not have immunities to. And they had a strong like militaristic culture, very wealthy empires in many places, and they had iron and steel, early steel working. Early, some historians actually say that the Bantu people possibly had iron working before other groups. So they had very much on par with Europe for most of history. European armies couldn't conquer into Africa like they could North and South America. Now that's going to change. Now India, now Africa, and eventually even China will fall prey to this new technology, this new technological advancement. So imperialism, the new wave of imperialism, is directly connected to the Industrial Revolution. These two things go hand in hand. Industry, the ability to produce and produce faster than ever before, directly leads to conquering the world, unfortunately. So we had some great advantages in the industrial age. Unfortunately, it's going to lead to some terrible abuses as well too.